Thanks so much for being willing to chat with me, man. This is an honor.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
So the reason I wanted to chat with you is because I kind of pitched a little bit of what this project was about in my email to you. But I tried to kind of, I don't know, I was interested in starting a podcast just because everybody was starting podcasts and it seemed like the thing to do. And I was trying to find a question that would be worth starting a project like this on. And I began to kind of stumble on this question, and I haven't even been able to fully form it yet. And each time I try to dive into it, it seems like it gets more complicated rather than making more sense. So I'm hoping maybe you can help me to unravel it a little bit.
I'll try.
So let me take it might take a couple minutes here to set the stage, but let me share with you a little bit of the premise of my thoughts here. I've been listening a lot to like Jonathan Peugeot and Peterson, and just kind of beginning and even reading who's it, Yuval Harari. Just all those guys have started to kind of cause me to think about like a general narrative, the general direction humanity is going, a history from way back up until now, and then thinking about the trajectory of humans and where we're going. And when I try to tell that story to myself, I kind of get stuck in this problem of thinking about technology. And I mean, I've just recently been listening through your The Meaning Crisis series as well, which has kind of helped me to unpack that a little further. But it seems like every time we invent technology is a way for us to sort of like expand ourselves a little bit and stretch ourselves a little bit past our previous limits in ability, but also it seems like in knowledge, in data that we have access to. I mean, I feel like I'm noticing, in one of your earlier lectures, you talked about like how, when we begin to be able to throw things, we begin to kind of be able to examine our actions because they're sort of further away from us, if I understood that right anyways.
Yeah.
So we have this like general, we're propelling towards stretching ourselves out, and we every technology we implement, the technology of the tribe, and then the technology of the city and the written word, and then the technology of things that allow us to move further. We're constantly expanding the amount of data that we have to process and that we're sort of socially expected to process in a somewhat meaningful way. And eventually we get to cars and then planes and then computers, which give us access to crazy amounts of data, and then the internet, and then ultimately now the smartphone. And it seems that like inevitably, obviously the more data that we have access to and that we're expected to process, the more we have to compress that data down. We have to simplify it. I mean, that's how data compression works. And so I guess that looks like ideology, or that looks like, I'm not exactly sure what that is, but there's a inevitable compression. Like we have the ability to compress data, and that's what we're stuck with. We just have to do that more and more and more and more. And I'll say this is where I'm getting stuck. Is like there's like 40 different directions that this goes in my mind, but fundamentally, at least there's that main problem of, okay, the world that we're experiencing because of the amount of technology that we have demands that we process more data than it seems like humans have ever had to try to process before. And so we're stuck with this problem of insane amounts of data compression, where I mean, and that the utility of compressing data, it just seems so useful, and then we end up like compressing our data about. I mean, I feel like a manifestation of this is like racism or so many types of prejudice or I don't know. The word I'm coming back to is just ideology. It's like it's a super simplified version of a story about the world. So there's more I want to get to, but I think I need you to help me out from here. Is anything catching about that story so far?
Yeah, but I think I wanted to challenge it a bit, because I think the problem that you're presenting as a recent problem is actually the perennial problem facing cognition. So, I mean, this is what I do my work on. The amount of information that has always been available to you is combinatorially explosive. The number of the patterns I can see in the environment, the things I can pay attention to, the amount of information in my long-term memory, the potential ways I can connect it, the possible sequences of actions I can perform. When you calculate the math for all of these, it's combinatorially explosive. It's always been the case that we have to do something like called relevance realization. We have to somehow sift through all this information. In fact, that's the wrong metaphor. We don't sift through it. We don't check all the information and then mark it as irrelevant until we finally sift through to the relevant information. In fact, somehow we ignore most of the irrelevant information and pick up on the relevant information. And that's why my face, for example, is standing out for you right now. And the doorknob behind you is not really salient to you. But it can be if you hear the doorknob turning, for example. And so that's always been that is still the main problem facing the AI project. Artificial general intelligences, even with their massive computational power, and so this has been the intriguing thing. The increase in processing speed has not been any kind of linear prediction of the capacity to generate, general intelligence. It hasn't. There have been some important breakthroughs, deep learning, and things like that, but they actually work on what I would argue principles very similar to what I'm talking about, which, and for example, you don't just do data compression, you do compression, and then you run variation, and then you do compression, and what you're doing is you're doing something very analogous to evolution, in which you create variation, and then you expose it to selective pressure, and then you revary from that subpopulation, and you do that, and what you're doing is constantly evolving your cognitive fitness to the environment. But that perennial problem comes with perennial threats, because when you do this process of sort of evolving how you're connected cognitively to the environment, zeroing in on relevant information, you do that by, as I said, ignoring vast amounts of information.
Right.
And that would be the case even if you were a computer the size of the Andromeda galaxy that could process that in nanoseconds. That problem doesn't go away. So the thing that's facing us is that we have not been paying very much attention to this relevance realization process until very, very recently. And we have been emphasizing more and more information processing.
Right.
And so while we have the resources, in some ways, of relevance realization, we're not doing a lot in our culture to think about, well, how do we improve people's capacity for this? And this brings out what I think is the central problem. The problem isn't the overwhelming amount of evidence. It's that when we are biasing our attention by ignoring a lot of information in order to be a cognitive agent, in order to be intelligent, you can't be a problem solver unless you're doing that, zeroing in on relevant information. And you can do it in many different domains in a highly self-organizing fashion. The problem that leads you to is you're inevitably falling prey to self-deception. Because what happens in self-deception is you can't lie to yourself. That doesn't make any sense. But what you do in self-deception is you bullshit yourself, using Frankfurt's notion, right? You pay attention to what's salient to the exclusion of what's the case. That's how advertising works. I make the alcohol salient to you by putting attractive men and women around it. You know that that's not what it's like in a bar. Just go to a bar. Just go to a bar. It's not like that. Yeah. And you know it's not true, but it doesn't matter because I've made the alcohol salient to you and connect. And so you'll buy the alcohol. That's how advertising works. It's bullshit, right? And so the very mechanisms that make my face salient for you right now so you can solve the problem of conversing with me are the very same processes that subject you to bullshitting yourself, deceiving yourself.
Yeah.
So the central question, I think, isn't, sort of data compression, but I do want to say something I think you're onto about that. The central question is, how do we enhance relevance realization in people so that they reliably overcome self-deception and keep evolving their cognitive fittedness to their particular problem environment. And that is the very ancient project of wisdom. That's what wisdom is. And I think we have a choice. And I think, so what I'm trying to suggest to you is I think you've put out one side of a choice that we're facing as a culture. One is we can pursue simplistic compression strategies, as ideology does. Or the other is, no, what we should do is do what other cultures have done perennially to deal with these perennial problems, is that we talk about, reflect upon, enhance our capacity for zeroing in on relevant information in a way that ameliorates our self-deception and enhances our cognitive fittedness to the environment. And so we should be thinking about what is it that would afford us choosing wisdom over ideology. And it's very much like what the difference between organisms that are highly evolvable and organisms that have tried a very locally advantageous specification, and they're locked in. And then when the environment changes, they can't adapt.
Right.
That's ideology. And see, and just to point out one way in which it does this, it's not only the content of ideology, it's the medium. See, ideology limits you to the propositional level of processing information. But most of that relevance realization is not going on at the propositional level. It's going on at a procedural level, a perspectival level, a participatory level. We can talk about that more if you want to get into. But it's a compression not only in the content, but in the manner of processing. You're actually reducing the number of functions by which you do relevance realization to bring to bear. Wisdom tries to do the opposite. It tries to reconnect and realign all these and then enhance your capacity for relevance realization in complex, novel, ill-defined situations. I think we actually face a choice in our civilization right now.
And that choice is between continuing to just, see, yeah, I feel like you've answered my question and brought up like 40 other questions that we could, or at least, I mean, there's a lot of content there, a lot of content's a gross word. There's a lot of relevant information there. But I mean, just to maybe distill down to a couple of key things. And feel free to interrupt me. I know I've noticed in your conversations with other people, you're one of the most polite conversationalists I've ever seen. You're going to make me feel more comfortable here if you feel free to interrupt me, because I might interrupt you.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. I generally like to hear people out because even if I'm disagreeing with them, I don't like to be premature in my response.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that you might be able to discern the most relevant time to take over.
Okay.
But so even the term, I mean, a lot of what you said is kind of covered in your first 10 lectures or so, and that's starting to make sense to me. Although the key, it seems like the key terms that you've coined is relevance realization, and I have even a little bit of difficulty understanding. I mean, this is probably easy for you to clear up, but relevant to whom? Like it's
well, that's the thing. I mean, so part of it is. The second half of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is the cognitive science, where I build the argument over about 30 lectures about what relevance realization is. So there's a bit of irony here. To sort of compress it.
Right.
So the relevance to whom is the important question. And it depends what you mean by that. I mean, there's an ontological question there and a political authority question. And I think we too much default immediately to the political authority question, which doesn't really help us, because I would argue I think with a lot of good evidence that many non-human species are intelligent and engaging in relevance realization. And the political authority question isn't the initial question. So the question is, well, relevant to a cognitive agent, right? Relevant to a system. Here's how I could put it. And this goes back to Reed Montague. One of the things that Reed Montague says that I really like. He says, the difference between us and computers is we have to care about the information we're processing. And the computer doesn't care for itself. We make it do stuff that we care about, but it doesn't care about what information it's processing. Now, why do we care about it? Well, We care about it because we're ultimately autopoetic beings. We are beings that are like, we're unlike tornadoes. We're not just self-organizing. We are self-organized to seek out the conditions that promote and protect and produce, in fact, our own structural functional organization. That's the difference between a tornado and a paramecium. Even a paramecium is right. So it seeks.
Sorry, I don't know what a paramecium is.
It's a microbe. It's a little like or a bacteria, right?
Okay.
A self-organism.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So this thing will swim towards where there's more sugar and swim away from where there's more poison, right? And even there, it's doing relevance realization because it's taking the sugar and it's realizing it as, listen to the language, important to it, import, to take in. And that matters to it, literally matters to it as sugar, as food, right? And there's not, and so even at that level, relevance realization is about, well, what is it? What is the autopoetic system that is taking care of itself? You are fundamentally, you have to take care of yourself as a living thing, and then, of course, as a cognitive thing, and then as a cultural thing. And so when you ask me, who's it relevant to? I'm going to say, well, it's relevant to you in different ways. Relevant to you as a biological thing, there because you're trying to maintain your biological existence. There's things that are relevant to you as a cognitive thing because your mind is also self-making. And then there's things that are relevant to you as being a participant in distributed cognition. And then if you ask me, well, what's the final gold standard of relevance? That's the wrong question. That's like asking, what's the final form of biological fittedness? There is no such thing. That doesn't make any sense. That makes sense if you were thinking of things politically and hierarchically. But if I say to you, you know what's happening in evolution? It's all working towards the final ultimate form of biological morphology. Well, that's crap. That's not how evolution works, right? And so it's relevant to whomever is being served in the processes of solving problems so that they stay alive. They stay alive biologically.
Yeah, I mean, it's just staying alive doesn't feel like a meaningful enough goal. Like it's like I want to be around for longer. Okay.
Well, that's not enough. That's only one thing, but it's also this other thing, which is the way you are a cognitive autopoetic agent, right? So you are. Well, let's do this. So one of the things you value cognitively is something above survival. Well, what is that? Well, that's something like meaning in life. Well, what's the empirical evidence about meaning in life? What makes people think their lives are more meaningful, worth living, above and beyond survival? Well, basically, it's a sense of how well they are fitted, how well that relevance realization machinery is working. People feel their lives are meaningful if they are well connected, they have a sense of being connected to themselves, to other people, and to something beyond themselves in some fashion. And well, why is that? Because, again, relevance isn't in you and it isn't in the environment. It's like evolutionary adaptive fittedness. It's the many ways so if you can fit to your world in many different ways and adaptively fit other people in many different ways and adaptively fit to yourself in many ways, you find your life more meaningful. And if you say why, I'm just going to say because you're a cognitive agent.
Right. Is it okay?
And then you're more than a cognitive agent, you're a cultural agent, which means you do this and you do it because you're a mammal and then a primate. You not only care about how things are relevant to you, you care about how you are relevant to others.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do that, you won't be able to bring up a child. Like that's one of the hallmarks of being a mammal, right? We because especially us, because we're born so premature, we have to care, have a child. You have to give up your egocentric concerns. You have to, your relevance to the child is way more important than how the child is relevant to you.
I mean, I agree with all that. I'm trying to put this together though with, like you said, you have to sift. You said you don't want to use the word sift through, but you want to figure out what's relevant to you on at least a couple of levels, socially, personally. But it seems that right now I think the thing that's frustrating to me is that there's so much expectation for everything to be relevant to me. Like, so many people want their story to be extremely relevant to me. There's so many people vying for my attention, and there's and there's some people doing it that are like genuinely just want attention. There's actually other humans that are like earnestly trying to get somebody to pay attention to them. And then there's also tons of sort of more abstract entities like businesses that are trying to get my attention so that way they can sustain themselves. And it seems like fundamentally they're tapping into three of my like most primal urges, like my urge to eat, my urge to procreate, and my urge to listen to stories. Probably, I think probably in that order. I don't know if that lines up with any canon of urges. that seems to me to be like at least some simple things I could point to is like there's some really basic circuits of like looking for things that are relevant to me that are being hijacked all of the time, and it seems that my only option when so many agents are vying for my attention, so many businesses, so many people, so much content is all set out there just to try to grab my attention and pull me into it. The only response that seems doable is to shut down and become extremely guarded, and that seems to be that sort of that ideology thing again. Ideology is an easy way of quickly brushing off things. I mean, maybe that's a bad definition of ideology, but that's at least what I'm struggling with there. Is just like I feel like everything around me is training me to be less and less patient with the world, and to be more and more quick to dismiss. Because
but why do you have to give in to that training? I mean, so you what I'm saying to you is, it sounds to me like you're treating your relevance realization machinery as a constant, and that the only variable is how much challenge is placed on it. But I want to challenge that. There are, like you certainly, I think, would believe that your relevance realization capacity greatly exceeds that of a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Yes? Well, as the child is to the adult is to the stage. Why do you think you're done?
Right. Well, I mean, the point of this project was to go and think, okay, so if I'm having difficulty relating to different people, which I think is a best place to start, because obviously I want to be more patient with people. Being more patient to try to discover ideas and tap into them, that's maybe second order. But I first just want to get better at actually engaging with people. So I decided to start just having a whole bunch of conversations with people.
Well, that's excellent. And so I'm very interested. Let's talk about one aspect. I'm not presenting this as an exhaustive response, but let's say as an exemplary response of what you're asking for. So one of the things that relevance realization uses is opponent processing. You find a trade-off between things, right? And so what you do is you get them to. Do you know what opponent processing is? Here, let me give you. Let me give you something that's a version of it, but also a good example. So one of the things you're constantly having to refit to your environment is your level of arousal, and I don't mean sexual arousal. I mean metabolic arousal, right? And so your autonomic, notice the word there, self-governing, right? Nervous system is split up into two: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, the sympathetic system is biased, and I'm using that language like we talked about in relevance realization. It tries to interpret everything as a reason for raising your metabolic energy, your metabolic level. Everything's a threat or an opportunity, and it's doing that. And the parasympathetic system is biased. It's trying to interpret everything as an opportunity to rest and relax and heal. And they're like this. They pull on each other. So your parasympathetic system tries to shut off your sympathetic system and vice versa. And you think, wow, what a stupid system. No, this is a powerfully self-organizing system. You get these two things. They're biased in opposite directions because at times you need to be very highly aroused. At other times you need to fall asleep. And the answer isn't to be Canadian and sort of be middlingly aroused all the time, right? So you have to be able to do this. You have to, and that's what I mean. You have to be able to evolve your level of arousal, and you do it with opponent processing.
Right.
Now we can enter into discourse where we can use I'm biased and you're biased. It's my side bias. Most of our cognitive processing is egocentrically biased. And what we can do, and this goes back to the Socratic notion, is we can understand that we can enter into opponent processing where you use my bias to correct you and I use your bias to correct me. And that's what dialectic and dialogue is. Or what we can do is we can reconfigure this not as opponent processing, in which there's a self-organizing process of self-correction between us that evolves our ability to collectively interact and solve problems together. We can reframe that as, no, what matters is that my ideas win. And this is a zero-sum game. Either my ideas or your ideas, and adversarial, and I have to destroy you. I have to demolish you or debunk you. And what happens is my capacity, it's even not good self-interest, because my capacity for self-correction and self-transcendence is truncated as I demolish or defeat you, or you'll defeat me, and my capacity to solve problems is truncated. So what we're doing is, although I'm winning, we're mutually destroying each other's ability to self-correct and solve problems. So what we can do is we can try and, well, there's too many ideas and too much or we can change the style from adversarial processing into opponent processing. That's what I've been trying to do with this whole project I'm engaged in, of trying to bring back Socratic dialectic and engage in a process that I call dialogos, rather than in this adversarial zero-sum game. I'm not proposing that as an exhaustive answer. I'm trying of how thinking about retooling your relevance realization gives you real concrete alternatives to the way we're just overwhelmed with opposing positions.
Yeah, I think that's mapping onto my experience pretty well, and non-zero sum game was immediately popping up into my head when you were talking about this, isn't it? There's some good sci-fi movie that talks about that concept recently. Maybe you saw it. I'm trying to think of it. Anyway, it's a good one where there's some time loops and really good music. I don't know why I'm not remembering it. Is it Arrival? Maybe. Arrival? I think it's Arrival. Anyways,
Arrival is a very good movie. Yes,
I'm pretty sure they talk about that concept in there, and that's what was coming up. But it sounds like you're saying, okay, or at least the way it's mapping onto the story that I'm trying to tell about this year and try to understand where I'm at is that initially I could only conceive of this problem in a pretty one-dimensional level. It's just, okay, I'm growing impatient with people, so I'm going to exercise patience, and patience becomes the new, all-encompassing goal. And at this point, I've found myself pulled out and stretched to my very limit, where I mean, this past week has been a pretty rough week. I feel like I've just emotionally totally run myself out. I've tried to just spend time being really patient, listening to other people's perspectives, and just stretching up my perspective. And it sounds like just having that simplistic of a goal isn't a good enough goal. I need to kind of allow that to feed back into the system and consider what would be relevant conversations to have. And I don't need to. I mean, it seems that like saying that you should just pay more attention to everybody and listen to everybody more. That seems like it sounds like a nice thing to do. It sounds like a good thing to do, maybe from some perspective. But that's not becoming my experience. I've been trying to just have conversations with whoever, and that's it's not working. It's just making me more. Well, it's not that I don't want to keep talking to people, but I'm at least noticing it's paying a huge emotional toll where I can't bring myself into that. I don't know. It's like I can't intimately connect with that many people. I feel like I'm not designed to do that. I have not evolved to do that. Blowing my Christian language here for a second.
Well, I don't mind you using Christian language. I have great conversations with Christians. I think I understand your point. Let me see if I'm getting it. There's a lot of potential conversations available to you, and it seems like the most charitable. I'm using a Christian word now. Most charitable thing to do in response to that is to try and talk to as many people as possible. And I don't think that's quite the right thing to do. What I'm trying to say is concentrate more on affording people a different kind of conversation and let that spread. And it doesn't have to be all tied to you. It doesn't have to all be tied to you. You don't have to be Atlas holding the world. All you have to do, right, is, right, you have to be one of the places from which a new way of connecting spreads, so that the machinery of distributed cognition, which is how we solve our most important problems, is bootstrapped up, and it goes through like a qualitative improvement in its capacity to process information. That's what I'm suggesting to you. So I'm suggesting to you, this is what I often mean when I talk about stealing the culture. I'm not talking about me being any kind of leader, and I'm definitely not talking about, a political top-down solution. It's like, it's modeled on, and I don't mean any disrespect by this. It's modeled on, like, the work of, St. Paul. He sets up just a bunch of little communities where people are practicing a new way of being, agape, and then that spreads. And he doesn't have to do it. Like everybody doesn't have to be connected to him. In fact, he dies way before the project comes to fruition. But it did work. The entire civilization changed in a fundamental way.
Yeah. It seems almost like a parasitic spread if it weren't for the fact that it isn't spreading and then killing its hosts. It's like spreading and then causing its hosts to. Yeah. So I think community does seem to be
symbiosis begins as a parasite. The mitochondria, they were originally parasites. Yes.
Yeah, I hearing that for the first time, and I think I read some of Dawkins for the first time about a year ago, and to my little Christian brain, after reading apologetics all the time in high school, suddenly hearing this story is like, wow, that's so incredible. I wish I had learned this before, but okay, that's helping me, but I still feel. Let me see if I can dip my head. This problem feels like at the limit of what I'm able to comprehend about my life, and I'm also trying to look at my own life, and it's hard to step back and.
But you should be there. Philosophy, wisdom begins in wonder, and wonder isn't the same thing as curiosity. Wonder is to get to the horizon of intelligibility and be at the place where emergence is possible. Look, we have our evolvability. We have to get to a place where our individual and especially our distributed cognition is at the stage of what's called criticality, where we are most open to the emergence of new intelligibility, because that's the only and you know what those moments are like. You have insight, you have flow experiences. And we have to get to that point of emergence, because the rate, and this was your original point, right? The rate of sort of social complexity is going up dramatically. Right. And the only thing we can do in order to do that is to shift. Instead of trying to evolve one or two strategies, what we need to do is evolve our evolvability. Learn how to more and more get our individual and collective intelligence at the point where emergence, so that we're evolving as things are changing, is the norm for us. It's the opposite of ideology. It's the exact opposite of ideology.
I get the feeling that there's a. I mean, obviously, personally, I can tell that there's a limit to what you can. It's like, obviously, you want to be on that horizon, but when you overstep that horizon, and then suddenly you become totally untethered from any sense of.
Well, you do and you don't. I mean, you have to be careful about that. I mean, so. I mean, right. If I push you too far, right, then you'll experience horror. But if I push you enough, you'll experience awe. And awe is profound, because it's one of the few experiences where the sense of self is shrinking, and yet people pursue it as positive and reinforcing.
You're saying awe comes after horror? Like it's beyond?
No. What I mean is, here's where you can assimilate everything, right? And here's where I push you, and you. Oh, let me get some terms first. Assimilation is when you make everything fit your established frames. Accommodation is when you alter your framing so you can fit a new world. So, and what you want for good relevance realization is and this is Piaget's idea of development, you want a constant balance. It's like the opponent processing within, right, the autonomic nervous system.
Right.
Assimilation is sort of stabilizing things. Accommodation is opening up for change and variation, and you want those to constantly be tethering back and forth. So if you assimilate too much, you're going to experience, a kind of, boredom, ennui, a kind of sense of futility, because nothing's changing, right? And then if I push you way too far, you can't accommodate. That's horror. But if I take you to the limit of where these two can stretch with each other, that's awe. That's when you're changing a lot and you're giving up a lot of your sense of self, but you think it's positive because what's happening there is you're basically evolving your capacity to evolve to new situations.
Right.
Did that make sense, or was that a little bit convoluted?
No, that makes sense. And to me, it even, again, going back, reprocessing all of the many myths I was taught growing up in Christendom, that I see a strong analog there, even between the Garden of Eden story of I feel like you can read that story as sort of an Adam and Eve transcending their limit a little bit, or a little bit too much. Your two terms, one they've already escaped me.
Assimilation and accommodation.
Okay, so they've gone beyond. Yeah, they've eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is categorically a bad thing for them. It's like they've taken too much knowledge and they've kind of lost themselves. And that's one way of reading it, anyways. And then in order to respond to that, there's this fig leaf phenomenon, and I think I don't know. I was relating to that story a little bit because I was just thinking about this feeling of being overdrawn and then retreating in this sort of escapism where I try to cover up all that, or maybe it relates to the story of the Buddha as well. It's like he tries after he's encountered this he sees the old man, he sees the dying guy, he sees all this stuff that he just can't make sense of. And he tries to return. He tries to go home, but that return doesn't work well enough. It's like that seems to be very analogous to the fig leaves. It's like you're trying to cover up the nakedness of reality that you can't comprehend, that you can't assimilate, or that you can't.
Right, and the point of the myth, because myths try to teach us about perennial patterns, not about the ancient past. Right, is that you can't do that. Right, the Buddha couldn't go back and stay in the palace. Yeah. And then what does he do? He goes out and he swings to the opposite. The palace is self-indulgent, so I'll practice self-negation. Yeah. And then what he realizes is that no. That he's got to get the middle path, which isn't the average between them again. Right. It's something, right? It's the opponent processing beyond both of them.
So that story is obviously important because it sounds like it's the beginning of the journey that actually has to repeat and continue to. It's just maybe with more nuance as he goes, like rather than it being this violent swinging of going out and then realizing, oh, this is way too much, and then returning, and then it becomes so self-indulgent. It's like,
well, I mean, the point of the myth. I'm finding myself in the odd position of defending the myth. The point of the myth. The point of the myth is the kind of qualitative change in his capacity for discernment and connection, for relevance realization, was at the fundamental level of the self, and therefore it couldn't be. It was something that takes a dramatic, reorganization of that process. Now, that doesn't mean that we all have to do it to that extreme, but the point of the myth is to tell you, look, you've got to give up with you're doing this, and if you're going to do this, like the evolving thing we've been talking about, you have to realize that a self is not something you have. You can't. The problem is both of these are they were locked in an adversarial position, right? You either self-indulgence is I have a self and I'm going to feed it whatever it wants, and self-negation is I have a self and I'm going to deny it whatever it wants and control it. And the point is those are both wrong. Those are both wrong ways of understanding the self, and you have to break through to a whole new framing of of how to relate to the self and how to relate to the world. And that's what I'm trying to propose to you. I'm trying to propose to you that what you need to consider is the possibility of that kind of breakthrough, Durkbrook breakthrough, as Eckhart. That's who's a German mystic that coined that term.
Yeah. Well, so I mean there's an analogy that comes in my head is it's very simple, just walking, right? In order for walking to take place, there has to be a constant trade-off between your left and right foot. Of
not only that. There's a constant trade-off between being stable and falling.
Right,
exactly. In fact, even when you're standing, even when you're standing, you're constantly falling. And what you've developed is a bunch of opponent processing that constantly keeps you moving in a way that gives you a kind of stability.
But is it within that analogy? there is a sense of actual passing off of, okay, at one point my right leg is bearing most of the weight, at another point my left leg is bearing most of the weight.
Yeah.
Is that happening in opponent processing, where it's like literally sometimes my parasympathetic system is totally...
Let me give you an example. The very thing that the Buddha, what did he do? What was the big thing he did? Well, what was he doing in his practices? He's pushing his attention. Notice the opponent processing in your attention right now. So there's a part of you that's trying to, and we even use the metaphor, concentrate. So you're trying to select and come down like this. And then there's a part of you that's running off and making associations, and it even may get distracted, and maybe for a minute you think, right, and you can even go into mind wandering. And what's happening is you're constantly doing this. It's like evolution. You're introducing variation, and then you're selecting down, and then variation and selecting down. And what the Buddha found was a way of taking that, right, and expanding what you might call the range of flexibility and dexterity. When he talks about the Eightfold Path and he says like right understanding, right meditation, it's right-handedness. It's not moral righteousness. It's the dexterity. It's the flexibility and the dexterity of the right hand. That's what he means. You're improving the capacity of attention. Look, you're always doing this. Whenever you're looking at any object, you're always moving between zeroing in to get detail, moving out to get the whole. Right. And where you stop depends on how you want to use it. Do I want to use it as a remote? Do I want to throw it as a weapon? Yeah. Right? And he found a way of qualitatively improving the complexity of your attention that's analogous to how superior your attention is to a 5-year-old's.
Right. It seems to me, I mean, that's a great example, and that helps, but the more you destate, like the more you emphasize, like let's say you have a fairly healthy relationship, you're doing opponent processing and it's working out all right, and then for some reason one of those teams, one of those sides, one of those systems just makes a really heavy-handed move, and they just totally take over. Yeah. The natural response is for the other side to hit back just as hard, or maybe harder, because now the stakes are higher, and obviously, I mean, this could take place on a cognitive level. It seems like this could take place on a sort of a tribal level, and I mean a conversational level, and I feel like on the level of this data processing story that I'm trying to think about, it seems like we've made such massive leaps into the amount of variation we've introduced that I don't know.
I disagree with you there. I disagree fundamentally with you there. I think what I think that's the way in which we're being bullshitted. We have massively increased a certain kind of information to the desertification of the kinds of information that are actually integral for meaning in life. Most of that relevance realization machinery, most of that connection machinery is not carried at the level of your beliefs and your propositions.
But there's such an expectation to engage with all of that, like even to participate in community. It's like, okay, if I'm going to go and actually have friends and not be a total outsider, I need to engage with my culture to a certain level. I need to watch movies. I need to be on the internet. I need to play video games. I mean, maybe I don't need to, but it seems like I do.
Well, I mean, again, I kind of feel like you're asking me for an algorithm around this, and the point is there are no algorithms about this. Like I have found that people are actually. I mean, let me give you again a concrete example of what I'm claiming. When I started doing Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I got a lot of people saying, nobody's going to be able to watch you for more than 7 minutes. Good grief. A YouTube video that's more than 7, you're doomed. And they're wrong. They're wrong. Like the first video has like 187,000 views. I've had many people have said they've watched the entire series 3 or 4 times. Yeah. I just had 2 conversations, both with Bernardo Castro. One was 3 hours, one was 4 hours.
I've watched some of that. That was great.
Yeah, tons of people. So the idea, no, that's not true. I mean, we're being led to believe it's true because it's in the service of people that want us to have short spans of attention, want us to be impulsive, But it's not the case that human beings have to have a short span and have to be impulsive, even in this hyper-technological cyberspace age.
But how are we supposed to interact with that content that is short form? And
I ignore it a lot.
But haven't you found that's made it difficult to engage in certain general social circles, like even your family?
Not really. I mean, sorry, I don't want to present this the wrong way. I don't want to come off as arrogant. I'm sure there's ways in which I'm just simply anachronistic and egocentric. I'm not trying to deny that. But on the other hand, I'm well aware of all the increasing evidence that Instagram and Facebook and spending too much time on Twitter and all is actually deleterious to your mental health.
Right.
And so I don't do that very much. And I seem, I don't know. I mean, I'm talking to you now because I seem to be able to generate social relevance without having to do all of that stuff, right? And I mean, I do some of it, but I also get other people to do it for me. Yeah. So again, I'm not trying to.
It seems like so. Then we're just one step away. I mean, maybe there's a way out of it along that path, but it's like, okay, well, I just get I get the privilege of not having to engage with it, while everybody else is just struggling with this horrible addiction to, 4 or 5 different types of addiction.
But wait, I'm actually trying to do a lot to afford people to get into the same place. I mean, I'm not only doing Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I did this 117, daily, where I'm teaching people to meditate, to contemplate, to do mindful movement, to learn the wisdom traditions from the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Neoplatonists, various therapeutic techniques into their daily lives, teaching and myself trying to, with others, develop this new art of dialectic and dialogos, get these authentic relating communities to talk to each other, network together. I hope not. I aspire to not be an elitist and secluding myself in some little epistemic, gated community while the rest of the world goes to hell. I'm trying to do the exact opposite.
Yeah. That makes sense to me, but I still feel a sort of a fractured. I'm trying to make sense of a very fractured life where maybe I have to kind of take some steps back. But there's a lot of when I try to relate to like a church community, that's difficult because I feel like I'm so, while I so appreciate that tradition on a really abstract level, I have such a difficulty participating and engaging with it because it feels so drastically different from my perspective.
But you're not alone in that. I mean, I'm a post-Christian person too, and the fastest growing demographic in our culture are the nuns, the Nones, right? People who have no official religious allegiance. And they're not because they're Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris atheists. That's not what's going on. That's only a very small fraction. Most of them don't reject the established religions because they've got some deep philosophical, atheistic argument against them. They reject them because they find the religions irrelevant for helping them cultivate wisdom and meaning. But that doesn't mean they sit around. The vast majority, I mean, this is the group of people that have made this rather useless phrase, common. I'm spiritual, but not religious. What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean? Right? And what is it you're trying to do? And what's amazing about these people is the degree to which they are trying to, they're trying to avoid political ideologies because they drench the world in blood. And they're trying to, they don't find the traditional religions viable. And then they're trying to get it's like the Buddha, they're trying to get something other than those two extremes. The problem with those people is they're still beset by North American or even European individualism.
They're still practicing a religion is a more abstract one that they can't see. It's not as easy to explain what that religion is.
It's also the religion of me, right? That's and it's a fragmented, autodidactic thing, and so it suffers from being, egocentric, from being autodidactic. And although those things really magnify your cognitive biases and really have a good chance of making things worse. So what they're trying to do, and this is what I'm involved with in participant observation, cognitive science theorizing, participant experimentation, is they're trying to recreate authentic ways of relating, communicating, and communing with each other. That's what's happening right now.
But your strategy, I mean, sorry, jumping back a tiny bit, your strategy here is not, like, you don't see a way out of figuring out how to incorporate, I mean, like, so I mean, I feel like you're agreeing with the fundamental premise of my story here, that we've kind of gone too far. We've introduced too much technology, and we're not actually capable of processing it well, and so we ignore that technology.
Well, but that's always been the case, right? That has always been the case for us with technology. But here's where we have a chance for a qualitative difference. We now have the science and the beginnings of the technology to make ourselves wiser in the use of the technology. We didn't have that before. We just had the technology and then we bumbled along. We actually have, we've gotten to the place where the cognitive science, even the cognitive science of wisdom, so, the psychotechnologies and the cyber technologies, there's a possibility of actually creating a virtuous loop where we use the technologies to potentially make ourselves individually and collectively wiser, so that we use the technologies to make ourselves individually and collectively wiser, so we use the technology, etc. We have the potential. That's a real potential. I'm not saying that's what's happening right now. We're in a race with, corporate bad faith actors, with the military, and yes, I've been approached by the military, who want to take all this stuff and make super psychopath soldiers. So I'm not saying there's an inevitable victory here, but what I am arguing for is a real possibility, and which means I think we have a moral responsibility to try and actually that real possibility as much as we really can.
So the school of cognitive science potentially might be an out. What's the metric that within that school is used? I mean, I feel like maybe you even tried to lay this out already, but how do they determine what is wisdom and what is not? I mean, there's still a fundamental sort of goal. There's axiom level goals here of like, okay, what is it that we're trying to do by being alive? Okay, we want to be alive longer. We want to participate on higher levels of community, maybe. But like, is there any clear cut like?
So there's two. I mean, and I was privileged to participate in a wisdom consensus paper that was published in 2019 in a major journal, where we get all of the people who are doing this research, right? So psychologists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists. And one thing we did is initially, this sounds like something out of Orwell, we formed the Wisdom Task Force of Toronto, and we all gathered in one room, either physically or virtually, and we bashed away at things for 10 hours, led by Igor Grossman. And I ask you to read the consensus paper, because it's exactly that. There's an emerging consensus of what it is we're talking about this in this phenomena. So that's at one end. That's sort of at the cutting edge of the science, and it's there. But then I would also say, you can look, but that resonates back with sort of the beginnings in something like Plato, because Plato has this profound idea that in addition to all of our manifold and culturally variable and idiosyncratically variable desires, we have two meta desires, which he argues are universal. One is we desire to be at peace. We desire to reduce the inner war within our psyche, reduce the anxiety, the depression, the sense of internal conflict. We want that optimal alignment of the various parts of our psyche, such that people will reliably say, well, what if I gave you a lot of sex, but it caused you a lot of internal conflict? They'll say, actually, in the end, I probably won't want that, right? Well, what if I gave you lots of fame, but it really ramped up your internal conflict? Oh, well, I don't want that, right? And cognitive dissonance is really, really punishing on people, right? So that's one thing. And Plato says, okay, so what you're trying to do is align all of these different ways in which you are adaptively trying to fit to your environment. Those different levels we were talking about. But Plato said there's something else, right? He said another meta desire you have is that you have the desire that whatever satisfies your desires is real. So I'll give you a concrete example, and I do this in my classes. I'll say to my students, how many of you are in really satisfying romantic relationships? And so I get the subpopulation. Let's say there's 50%. And so I said, now of those people, how many of you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you even if that meant the destruction of the relationship. 95% of the people put up their hand. And I ask them, well, why? And they'll say, because it's not real. And then Plato had this brilliant insight, and this is how it goes. He realized that most of our self-deception is driven by this inner conflict. And as we get more aligned, we reduce our self-deception, which means we get better at picking up on the real patterns in the world. And then as we get better at picking up on the real patterns in the world, we train that skill more, and then we can turn it on ourselves and get better at picking up on the real patterns in the psyche. And we can even better coordinate and align it. And then as that improves, our self-deception goes down, and we can even better pick up on the real patterns. And it goes like this. There's the possibility of the two meta desires not just being out there, but of mutually affording and reinforcing each other in a virtuous, not a vicious, in a virtuous cycle.
A virtuous cycle. I like. Is that a John Vervaeke original? The virtuous cycle.
No. A virtuous cycle is a philosophical a term that's generally used for a process that has that kind of aspect to it. And the way to think about this is to think about what I'm proposing to you is the opposite of what my friend and colleague Mark Lewis called his model of what addiction is. Addiction is the opposite. Addiction is not this reciprocal opening between you and the world. Addiction is a reciprocal narrowing. So let's do the opposite. You're really stressed, so you take some alcohol to reduce the stress. So your cognitive flexibility goes down. So your ability to solve problems in the world goes down. So you lose options. So you get more stress. So you take more flexibility. And then notice what's happening. The world is shrinking in its options, and you're shrinking in the flexibility until you eventually
yourself into a rut.
Yeah, you eventually can't be anything other than you are, and the world can't be anything other than it is, and that's addiction. But what I'm saying to you, and I said this to Mark, I said, if it can narrow down reciprocally, it can open up reciprocally. And he went, oh, right, that's Plato's claim. That's Plato's claim. And what's interesting about that is you know what I'm talking about, because that's what happens when you fall in love, not just romantic, friendship love with somebody. This is the work of Aaron. That's a last name, not a first name, and other people. This is how people fall in love. I open myself up a little bit to you, and you reciprocate by opening yourself up a little bit to me.
And it
so
expands it expands our ability to be open and our ability to think in our options.
Right. Mutually accelerating disclosure. We experience that as love, falling in love. So what we can do is fall in love with being when we do this platonic reciprocal opening. Plato called it anagoge. And knowing enough about, we're learning enough about cognition and self-transcendence and meaning in life. It's all in that, and a lot of it's pointed to in that wisdom consensus paper, that this is not some just philosophical fancy. This is a real possibility right here, right now.
So it seems like that. I mean, that sounds great, and that sounds like a magical experience. I've fallen in love. I'm married, and I've had the experience of falling in friendship love with people and just having something click. But that doesn't always happen.
No.
There are there are people that it takes a lot. It's like there are relationships that are seemingly one-sided, and you're kind of hoping that eventually something might open up on the other side, and then maybe real love will begin to happen. But you only have so much energy to do that too. I'm trying to bring this back to the scale of thinking about racism and prejudice and homophobia and on all these different things. All these ideological traits. There are ideas that are actually beyond our patience level to comprehend.
You're not going to solve this problem, nor am I. And we don't solve most problems as individuals. The problem of us getting in this interview? Notice all the technology, the electronic grid, it's always distributed cognition. And you're not managing most of it. Neither am I. I didn't create English. Did you? Right? So again, what I'm trying to say is it's not about trying to get all my relationships to be where I'm falling, but what I want to do is increase my capacity to fall in love, and not just with people, but with aspects of the world, aspects of reality. That's the point, right? I need to be able to fall in love with being if I'm going to have a viable lived response to nihilism. But the point is to do that with enough people and they can do it with enough people, and they can do it with enough people. You don't have to change society by moving 100% of the people. You have to move between 10 to 20% of the people. And all you have to do is give them a qualitative advantage, a new way of being that catches enough that it can redirect the society as a whole.
So this is something I was talking about with JP a little bit. I grew up in evangelical circles, and so that was the theology that I understood. And then I'm talking to him, and he grew up Catholic, and has been recently, continuing to kind of re-engage with that lifestyle and reprocess it. And I've been attempting to do somewhat of the same thing. I don't want to give up the connection I have to my evangelical community, especially considering how my family, my parents and my family around me are pretty deeply involved in like evangelical ministry, and like that's their life. If I step outside of that, I don't get the privilege of engaging with my family on that level anymore. And so I've been trying to rescue my tradition as much as I can, or at least rescue my engagement with it.
And so you should. I talk with JP, and I'm not expecting to drag him into naturalism, right. Nor is he expecting to drag me into Catholicism. But what happens is we both take each other to the horizon of intelligibility. We both get into dialogos. The mark of dialogos is that he gets to a place where he couldn't get to on his own, and I get to a place where I couldn't get to on my own. And then that spreads.
Yeah.
And I'm able to care about him without necessarily, becoming Catholic or him becoming a naturalist. Same thing with Paul van der Klee. Same thing with Jonathan Pajot. But same thing also with Muslims that I have good faith dialogue with. The thing that, again, let me point one thing out. Just some empirical research. It's by one of my RAs and TAs. Right? He did work on people trying to cultivate wisdom, and what he saw was the people that are within a religious tradition outperform people that are merely secular. But what he equally found is that it doesn't matter which tradition you're in. Right? Which means people think it's mostly about the belief, but it's not. It's about the skills of your know-how. It's about the state of consciousness of your perspectival knowing. And it's your capacity for transforming your identity at the level of participatory knowing. That's what matters. And if you can connect to your family in good faith at those levels, it doesn't if they want to maintain a connection with you, that's actually where most of the connection machinery runs.
Right. Yeah. Well, yes. So I'm still running this process in my brain, trying to figure out exactly how to truthfully live out my experience with trying to understand truth and how to live in the world and having a past that's evangelical. But what I was bringing up with about JP is that he brought up this idea of was totally foreign to me, but he talked about like within the Catholic tradition, there's an idea of when there's a church, there's an angel of that church. And Pajot, I think, talks about this concept as well. It's just the idea of like a distributed cognition taking on a sort of self. Or it's
he got that from me.
That's great. That I didn't realize I was
not the idea of the angel, but the idea of a dynamical system that self-organizes and a collective intelligence that's running on distributed cognition.
So
very much.
He seems to go plugs that right into. Pajot, anyways, totally goes as far as to say that's the process of becoming part of a larger self. Ultimately, the destination there from a mythical perspective is I'm forgetting the Orthodox word. It's like theosis.
Yeah, theosis,
right.
Which is to become godlike. That comes from the Neoplatonic tradition that considerably predates Christianity by many centuries.
This has been so interesting to me, starting to pay. Like I've only in the past month or two started to try to actually work my way. You'd kind of been a sort of a peripheral figure in my consciousness congress, I'll say.
Yeah.
But recently, started to listen through these lectures. It's just, obviously Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. I'd heard those names hundreds of times, had no idea why I heard those names or what thoughts they were responsible for, but beginning to see how much what they thought about and what they have to offer has influenced even my tradition has been really eye-opening. And I don't know, it's continuing to make me want to well, I definitely want to keep listening through the series that you've done, because it's very, very interesting to me. But
well, thank you. Great, that's good. I mean, you're actually exemplifying the very thing I've been talking about. And I mean, I could recommend a book to you. I read a really good book called "Returning to Reality: Christian Platonism for Today," and he makes the argument that it's actually the integration of Christianity and Platonism that is the what you might call the spiritual grammar of the West, whatever that refers to, and because Christianity gives us the agape side, and Platonism gives us especially Neoplatonism gives us the logos side. It gives and Christian Platonism basically integrates those together in kind of an opponent processing. You might want to check that book out because it might give you a way of tapping into your spiritual heritage in a way that gives you a much more encompassing cognitive cultural grammar, rather than what was passed on to you, through Protestant evangelical Christianity that has shrunk a lot of this in ways that probably could.
I'll say I personally feel frustrated with my own tradition to the extent that that I feel like it lines up with the definition of an ideology, or I feel like it's in a lot of ways cut its own legs off as far as being able to interact with the world physically, but the ideas of the world and
yeah, and I agree, and I came out of a fundamentalist Christianity, so maybe I'm trumping you with an even more stringent version of Christianity that was actually very traumatic for me. Although I've come to, that's why I read books on Christian Platonism, because I've come to try and also appreciate what that gave me. You're like, English is my mother tongue, and Christianity was my mother religion in that sense, right? And that's why I'm recommending to you Christian Platonism, because Tyson makes a very good case for it being simultaneously something that reaches into the Christian heritage and legacy, but also is completely intellectually respectable and justifiable today as a profound response to, well, what very much is in that book, The Meaning Crisis. Now, I differ with him on certain things, but I'm offering that as something that might help you bridge to your past in a helpful way.
And one of the things the reasons I feel sort of, obviously there's a social level of just, I don't want to lose the connection to the community that I'm actually a part of, but also I've just thought about the idea of, like, to the extent that my community was tapping into true patterns about the world and true understandings of the way the world works, if I kind of shrug all of that off and put it in a category that just reads, this is toxic, don't go anywhere near any of this, everything that was true about it suddenly becomes toxic by extension. And there's this growing demon that sprawls out of there that I just don't want to pay attention to eventually half or maybe all of reality.
So, I recommend, sorry, this is self-promotional, but keep going with Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And that's why I was also recommending the book to you by Tyson, because what I'm trying to show you is there is a way of just throwing out the bathwater and keeping the baby, if you'll allow me a twisted metaphor, because there is...
I don't know who had tubs that have big enough drains to flush babies down them.
No, there were tubs like this, and you threw out the water like this.
Oh, okay. That analogy makes way more sense in a context of a bucket.
They were big tub. Metal. I'm old enough, because I'm from the before time. There's this big tub. There were these big metal tubs, and you put the baby in it with the bathwater, and that's how you would bath a baby. And then
Don't
the idea,
throw out the okay.
yeah,
That throw is a key
out
word.
the baby with the bathwater.
Makes a lot more sense. Sorry. So, but there is an actual way to not throw the baby out, and is it?
Yeah, very much.
It's not as simple. I mean, within the actual analogy, you can just lift the baby out first and then flush the bathwater out. But it doesn't seem that's as easy. It seems like that's where the analogy must reach its limit, because the process of sifting.
We're not quite there. We're past that. We have already had 4 centuries of trying to throw out the bathwater for various good reasons. And now we're really having to lean out and stretch to try and grasp the baby before it exceeds our potential to grasp it and bring it back in. So that's where we're at in the analogy right now. At least that's what I argue in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Good. Well, there was like 3 or 4 other things that I wanted to talk about with you, but I feel like they're probably all a good hour and a half conversations anyways, and I realize our time's a little bit limited, so we should probably... I feel like you've at least given me some tools to help process this problem. It isn't... I don't have this sense of just everything's clicked in it, and I'm magically, my life makes sense totally. But I feel like I've been pushed in that direction.
Something had gone really wrong.
That would be the opposite of everything we've been talking about.
Exactly.
So, thank you so much for chatting with me, John. This has been enlightening.
Well, thank you, Garrett. I've enjoyed it a lot. It's been a lot of fun. And, on a more personal note, keep going. I don't want to sound like Augustine here with offering my personal testimony like that, but, I'm on a journey very similar to you, and I'm older and I'm farther down the road. Now I sound like your grandfather. But, keep going, because these things are existentially resolvable, but they require... You're not just going to think your way through this change that you're pursuing.
Sorry, you cut out for 1 second. They were going to require some what?
They're going to require some transformation. You're not just going to think your way through this.
Right.
That's not how it's going to happen. It's very much like what you're talking about earlier about becoming friends. You can't just think your way into a friendship. It doesn't work that way.
Right. Well, thanks for that. No, sometimes I really want to have that clicking experience. And it's confusing because there are moments that give the sensation of that experience of like, well, at least there's a sense of like,
they matter. See, the 2 mistakes people make is they think it's got to just be one Titanic Freudian insight, and then I go, oh my God, now I'm free. Or they think, oh, it's just endless plugging with no insight. What you have to understand is that insight is you taking another step, but it's a different kind of step than the incremental steps. But it's never going to be, that doesn't happen. Yeah. Or at least it's extremely rare and only shows up in stories that are at least 300 years old or something like that.
I was going to say, isn't that's I still don't understand exactly what's happening in this point with the Buddha where he attains enlightenment, and like reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead last year with my friends, like, I don't get what that experience is like, but that's probably...
Well, I try to offer an account of that later in the series, but don't forget, the Buddha went through 6 years of transformative processes that were at a level of dedication that would be equivalent to like 25 years for most of us. So once you've done 25 years, then you can sort of say, what's up, Siddhartha?
All right. So when I'm 50, then I can start complaining.
The Buddha said, and I'm not a Buddhist, but the Buddha said, the jar, drop by drop, the jar is filled. And you won't think the jar is filling for the longest time. And then suddenly you turn around and go, wait,
that's different.
The jar is filled.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm feeling some dripping sensations, anyways. So I know that's a terrible analogy. Well, that was interesting. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to share it with a friend, or even better, take whatever you found interesting here and go and have a real face-to-face conversation with somebody that you care about, or somebody that you don't understand very well. I think face-to-face conversation is one of the most important tools that we have for building and maintaining real relationships and real communities. Many institutions in our lives have an incentive to crowd out these longer, more engaging interactions with short-form junk food content. I get it. They're just trying to make money. The point of this project for me is to spend some time pushing back against some of those forces in my life. I want to practice listening to and engaging with people that I don't necessarily understand very well. I also want to spend some time listening to and learning from some people who seem to have a good track record of listening to and engaging with people that they disagree with. If you're interested in working on some of this stuff too, feel free to keep up with this project by subscribing and pressing the little bell thingy that lets YouTube know that you want to keep seeing these videos. I really think that if we can get better at conversation, we might actually change the world. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.